dead tomorrow and the next day and the next day and next month.
This land is your land, and this land is my land.
America's never had a rosy image of Mexico, seeing it either from a flawed economic perspective, assuming everyone south of the border is poor, or from a social perspective tainted by nationalist rhetoric and poor media sources that present the entire country as a playground for drug cartels. No surprise that with the previous outright racist occupant of the White House, there's a renewed wave of anti-Mexican sentiment sweeping the country. What former President Donald and his followers don't seem to grasp is that the actual criminals in Mexico predominantly prey on their fellow citizens. The sad part is Americans aren't overly concerned with Mexican victims. It takes someone white and American to be affected before people in the US feel compelled to worry about crime across the border.
Miles from his Brownsville home, Mauricio Rodriguez stared in disbelief at the Santa Elena Ranch, at a one-room shack filled with candles and other reminders of the devil worship that ended the life of 21-year-old Mark Kilroy, one other unnamed U.S. citizen, and 10 Mexicans.
2007's Borderland is a fictionalized story about Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, an infamous cult leader, drug dealer, and serial killer. Adolfo preyed upon Mexicans, sometimes even within his own cults, whether it was keeping them hooked on drugs to line his and his associates' pockets, or murdering them to feed his nganga, an iron cauldron used in the Palo Mayombe practice for divination, with blood sacrifices. He killed for nearly 3 years, amassing a confirmed body count of 23 people, though the actual number is estimated as being far beyond that. It wasn't until he murdered a 21-year-old American college student named Mark Kilroy that the full force of the law finally came down upon him and his followers. What Borderland does so effectively is portray the negative American perspective on Mexico in its protagonists, 3 young American men preparing to head off to college, before having them run into a villainous character based closely on Constanzo. The ultimate irony being that, for all the xenophobic, racist talk from white characters, Constanzo himself was not Mexican. He was an American. Adolfo was born in Miami, Florida during 1962. His mother, Delia Aurora Gonzalez del Valle, was a Cuban immigrant. She moved them for a while to Puerto Rico after her first husband died, returning to Miami again in 1972. Adolfo was baptized a Catholic while also learning voodoo on trips with his mother to Haiti. His mother was a practitioner of Palo Mayombe. She believed her son was a psychic, supposedly having predicted the 1981 attempt to assassinate US President Ronald Reagan. As a teen, Adolfo also became friends with a Haitian priest in Miami, from whom he learned more about Palo Mayombe, and also had to deal drugs and con people for money. Perhaps the most significant, formative experience of the young man's life. As an adult, Adolfo would later move to Mexico City. He eventually started using magic to extort people for money and got close with various drug dealers and hitmen, as well as corrupt policemen and members of bourgeois Mexican society. One crime family run by brothers Elio and Ovidio Hernandez gave half ownership of their drug operation to Adolfo in return for his protection using Palo Mayombe rituals. He brought together a varied cult of people later dubbed the Narco-Satanists. His followers called him Papa, or El Padrino, which is English for Godfather, and they worshipped him.
Outside, a scorched cauldron still holds the remains of what authorities say is human brain matter, animal parts, and blood.
Constanzo became somewhat untouchable in Mexico due to his high society and narcotics connections. Borderland opens with a scene depicting two rogue policemen trying to take the cult down, only for one of them to be brutally killed in front of the other. This epitomizes that sense of Adolfo being untouchable, yet the real story was even more devious. Constanzo convinced his followers they were all protected by the magic he conjured from his nganga. He told the cult they were invincible in a literal sense. In the opening scene of the film, a cultist tells the cops, "Your bullets can't hurt us." This is based on one of Constanzo's followers, Serafin Hernandez, whom police tailed to Rancho Santa Elena, where Constanzo and his cult operated in Matamoros. Hernandez drove through a police roadblock without stopping because he believed what El Padrino told them, that they were not just invincible, they were invisible. Hernandez was genuinely shocked to find the police behind him when he got to the ranch, then dared them to shoot him because he was sure the bullets would actually bounce off him. The grip Constanzo held over people in Mexico was not because of magic, it was due to his expertise as a con man. After police raided the ranch, during which Constanzo later died, they found journals kept by the cult leader. Some of them documented people paying as much as $40,000 for magical services rendered over the course of 3 years. Many Mexican smugglers originally came from a peasant background, meaning they were often raised in an environment which fostered belief in folktales and Mexican witchcraft, aka brujeria. This left them susceptible to the exploitation of Adolfo. Although his followers were comprised of all social demographics, his main source of income was the cartel. Drug dealers make more than enough money not to be considered working class. The targets of his murderous magic were often his own followers, family members of rival drug dealers, or more vulnerable people like Raul Esquivel, a crossdresser and former lover of another cult member. On top of the murders themselves, corpses or just dismembered body parts were sometimes dumped, like those of Esquivel, in public for people to find, spreading terror across Mexico City.
Rise and shine,
The tragic perspective about Mexican victims versus the one American victim in Constanzo's trail of human sacrifice is hammered home by the casually racist and xenophobic attitude towards Mexico in the film's white American protagonists. Early in Borderland, one of the Americans, Henry, lays out a decidedly Republican worldview, and nearly every instance of his dialogue in the screenplay furthers it. He chastises one of his friends for sounding slightly progressive by saying,
"What are you gonna do next? Buy a Volvo and join the fucking Democratic Party?"
He goes on to refer to America as over-regulated, but doesn't see Mexico as a land of freedom. Rather, he sees it through a racist lens as a place to indulge in animal urges. His friend Ed, portrayed as a somewhat less xenophobic American, isn't exactly what you call progressive either. Ed stops a guy from roughing up a female bartender by saying she's no pro, implying a misogynistic conception of women who do sex work. Nevertheless, he hooks up with the bartender, and because she lives in Matamoros, he's automatically scared she could have AIDS. Ed might not be a card-carrying Republican like his buddy, but he wouldn't have trouble fitting in with red state voters. In a scene at the police station, Henry and Ed search for their friend Phil after he disappears. Henry sees a religious shrine and quips, ironic given his young Republican-like attitude, supporting a party that loves maintaining a close relationship between church and state. Henry's similarly frustrated at a lack of English-speaking cops in a predominantly Spanish-speaking country when, in America, people who can't speak English are treated with disdain by conservatives. These various moments are all a part of the mindset that America is at the world's center. It's this exact mentality that helped feed real-life apathy in the face of Constanzo's crimes. Mexican police weren't able or overly willing to track down a murderer of drug dealers and cross-dressers. But soon as Kilroy, a white Christian American, went missing, authorities felt pressure to throw the full force of the law at tracking down Constanzo and his cult. Kilroy's parents passed out thousands of missing person leaflets and offered a $15,000 reward for any information about their son's whereabouts. America's Most Wanted broadcast Kilroy's disappearance across America. Mark's parents even got US politicians involved. In the end, despite all the effort due to Kilroy becoming a victim of Constanzo's, the case's big break came from an unrelated anti-drug operation along the border, conducted in a joint effort by the US and Mexico.
They wrapped heavy duct tape around his eyes and forehead and face and his head. They assured him that he was not going to be harmed, that he was not in danger. They fed him some bread and water, we understand, and then one of them ultimately came up behind him with the machete and...
For years, nothing happened to Adolfo. The people he killed were considered inconsequential by Mexican society. He went on to kill from 1986 until 1989. In March of '89, he became unsatisfied with the recent Mexican victims' lack of reaction to the horror they were experiencing during a sacrifice ritual. So he ordered an Anglo be brought to him, and his followers went out looking for a white American. Seraphin and others went driving around Matamoros. That's when they came upon a drunk young man stumbling in the street. Mark Kilroy, a US college student on spring break, quickly found himself in danger. Just like in the film Borderland, Phil finds himself in a similar danger. Soon he was handcuffed with his face wrapped in duct tape. Men put him in the back of a truck and took him towards Rancho Santa Elena. This event and the events which followed make up the main plot of Borderland. When Phil is abducted off the streets just like Kilroy, he's taken to the ranch, and there he meets Santian, closely based on Constanzo, and comes to a grisly end. Similar to the real Kilroy, Phil is kept alive for a while, tied and left in the heat. In the film, an American cult member looks after Phil, giving him a little food and water, though he proves to be as psychotic as the others. In reality, Kilroy was given egg, bread, and water by a Mexican farmer working at the ranch where the cult operated. The irony is that the fictional American is part of the cult's evil, whereas the actual Mexican farmer who helped Kilroy was not and only worked at the ranch. Constanzo was American, which people often ignore, so this depiction of an American character taking part in the cult's activities is another instance where the film makes a point of distinguishing who's actually part of the violence versus who's wrongfully assumed the culprit. Apart from that, these acts of kindness were few and far between for the actual victim. Kilroy, like Phil in the film, wound up hacked to death by a machete. His brain was placed in the nganga for Constanzo's use in ritual divination. Months later, the ranch was raided by police. Just over a dozen cult members were eventually taken into custody. Not Adolfo. He ordered one of his followers, a hitman known as El Dubi, to shoot him and his lover to death with a machine gun. 14 followers received anywhere between 35 to 67 years in prison for multiple murders, including drug and weapons offenses to boot, and 2 were still never caught. Borderland has its Adolfo-inspired character die at the hands of a rogue policeman. In reality, Constanzo avoided any and all persecution through cowardice, and an act of what amounts to suicide, allowing those left behind to take up his blame. Borderland ends with the last living American character escaping a violent confrontation with Constanzo's cult. On-screen text tells the viewer about 50 bodies dug up at the ranch, and other details closely mirroring the actual case. The film doesn't touch on the aftermath of Kilroy's murder outside of the action-filled finale. Although it doesn't explore Constanzo as an outsider in Mexico either, the racist attitudes of the white American characters in the film still illustrate the way in which Mexican victims, or Mexicans in general, are disregarded as unimportant. Like living south of the US border automatically resigns them to living amongst crime and violence and death. The full extent of this aspect in the screenplay might be lost on those who know nothing about Constanzo or his crimes. All the same, The conservative US ethos of Borderland's main characters is enough to make obvious part of what the film is attempting to do. It might seem their xenophobic concerns are justified after they fall into the cult's hands, yet there's obvious intent on the part of the filmmakers, from the racist pre-MAGA rhetoric of Phil and to a lesser extent Ed, to the American cult member playing a part in sacrificing a fellow American, to show how assumptions about Mexico played a significant part in Constanzo's real story.